We live in a time where a cartoon sponge knows more about American history than most teachers. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Whatever land Bjarney Herjulfsson and his crew were looking at, it was not Greenland. Several weeks had passed since they departed Iceland from the village of Ærjar, bound for a larger island to the west, only for fog and poor winds to drive them off course just 3 days into their journey. To make matters worse, not one man aboard Herjulfsson's ship had ever sailed into the Greenland Sea, leaving them with only the cloud-masked sun and stars to guide them. So it was that when the heavens finally broke open, Bjarney's best option had been to continue heading west. But something wasn't right about the coastline before him. Greenland had been described to him as a place of mountains, and yet this was a place of forests and small hills. And for that reason, he continued on with his journey, though now they sailed north, and after 2 days, they found themselves alongside a different sort of place. Here, the land was flat and covered with trees, and the weary crew asked if perhaps they had finally come to their destination. But Bjarney once again held off, because Greenland was described to him as a place of mighty glaciers. And with that, they sailed off to sea, heading northeast as the wind carried them until they came upon yet another land. This one high and mountainous and capped by glaciers, just as Greenland was described. But still, something didn't sit right with Bjarney, restless as his crew was to go ashore. Something about the land gave him pause, though he could not say what, and he opted to continue sailing until after 4 more days, they came to yet another land. And this time, the captain was confident that they were in the right place. Finally, after weeks of desperate searching, they had arrived in Greenland. And Bjarney's intent on his voyage was to join his father Herjulf in the new colony led by Eric the Red, situated at the southern tip of the island, and there he remained for the rest of his father's days, content to live the simple life of a farmer in this strange new world. With his father's passing, however, Greenland lost some of its luster, and some 15 years after his arrival in the New World, Bjarney sailed to Norway to seek a new career under the Jarl Erik Håkonsson. There may be a lot of me struggling through Icelandic and Norwegian names in this video, and I apologize, but I'm doing my best. Also, under the weather, so I sound a little nasal. I apologize. It is what it is. In any case, Bjarney's host was, as other members of his court were, very interested in Bjarney's stories of the Greenlanders, but all were astonished to find that Herjulfsson himself held so very little curiosity about those unknown lands to the west. Many of them even criticized Bjarney for lacking the exploratory, endeavoring spirit so common amongst their people, and the following year he was sent back to Greenland. Now, what Bjarney's role in Greenland was may never be known, but one possibility is that he was asked to encourage further exploration of those forested places he'd seen all those years ago. Word quickly spread of Bjarney's journeys across the Western Sea, and soon after his arrival, a young man of Icelandic birth approached him with interest in undertaking a voyage of his own. He was a wealthier member of the colony, well regarded by his peers, and ambitious to follow in the pioneering footsteps of the father who brought him to that hard land some 20 years prior. Bjarney himself was finished with his travels and wished only to live out his days in the peace and tranquility of his farm, so he sold the ship to a young man who wished to see the western lands for himself. The famed Eric the Red, the governor of the Greenland colony, was to lead the journey, but at the very last moment he fell from his horse and wounded his leg. And taking this as a sign from the gods that his voyages had come to an end, Eric left a son to carry on in his place. A son named Leif. And for nearly 1,000 years, Norse legend held that Leif Eriksson, after following Bjarney's journey in reverse, established a settlement on the coastlines of a rich land far to the west, beyond the mountains of Iceland or the fjords of Greenland, a land where wild grapes and grains sprouted unhindered, where the winters were free from snow, and where fish and game abounded beyond the wildest dreams of those living at the northern edge of the known world. It was a place of unimaginable beauty and wealth, with boundless opportunities for those willing to go and test their will against the wilderness beyond the seas. It was a place that, when all others were named for ice, stone, and trees, took on the name of Vinland, the land of wine. But as so often happens, this paradise was not without its dangers. Viking sagas tell of battles with violent inhabitants called Skraelings, as well as seas filled with ship-devouring worms somewhere between the New World and the Old. Perhaps living there was too dangerous, or the journey back to civilization too uncertain. Whatever the case, for much of the last 1,000 years, the stories of the Norse voyages to Vinland remained little more than that. Stories. It wasn't that the tales were unbelievable, in fact they were far from it, but rather that nobody could find the alleged settlement built along the shores of some place in Canada, or the United States, or, according to one very odd hypothesis, Africa. At least, not until 1914, when an amateur historian from Newfoundland by the name of William Munn produced a pamphlet suggesting a very specific location for the place known in the sagas as Leif's Booths. 45 years later, explorer and archaeologist duo Helgi and Ann Ingstad began digging at a site just outside of a little hamlet called Lanzo Meadows. And as they removed layer after layer of dirt from what locals knew as the Old Indian Camp, artifacts of decidedly Norse origin appeared, and alongside them the remnants of what could only be a Nordic colony. Finally, after nearly a millennium, there could be no doubt as to whether or not the Greenlanders had discovered those lands to the west. Yet for some reason, a people for whom traveling to new worlds by the ocean tides was a way of life, a people who scratched a living out of rocks and snow as frequently as soil and sand, failed to conquer them. And nobody can say for sure why that is. But you know what we can say for sure? The food in Vinland was definitely a lot better than anything they were eating in Greenland. It was all seal meat and fish paste. And if you want to live a life where you don't also have to eat seal meat and fish paste, you can do that with today's sponsor, Factor. Factor is a meal delivery service that we've been working with for as long as I can actually remember having sponsors, and the reason we do that is that we genuinely like the product. You know, with as busy as life is right now, sometimes it's hard to find the time to cook, to go grocery shopping, to clean up, and just it's all a big hassle. And then takeout, it's so expensive, and there's so many calories, like so many calories. And I guess, you know, the one upside of cooking for yourself or having takeout is that you don't ever have to settle for the same 3 monotonous meals over and over and over again. But the nice thing about Factor is that it gets rid of all of those problems all in one convenient package. There are 35 different meal options every week, so you can really not have to worry about choosing the same thing over and over again. They come in multiple different diet plans, so you've got Calorie Smart, Keto, Protein Plus. These meals are all chef crafted, they're dietitian approved. If you've been watching the videos for a while, you've heard this whole spiel because, again, we like the product. Another thing that I really like about Factor is that you're not stuck with just entire meals. They have a whole bunch of snack options, they have smoothies, they have desserts, they have breakfast. So you're really looking at kind of a wide range. And it's all extremely convenient because I don't have to sit and wait for my food to get there. I don't have to wait for it to actually cook. I just go into my fridge, I grab a box, I stick it in my microwave, 2 minutes later I have a meal. Another really awesome aspect of Factor is that you can decide how many meals you actually get each week, and you can choose from as few as 4 and as many as 18. So if you're on a budget, it's also a smart way to make sure that you can meal prep for 1, 2, or even 3 people. And when I say on a budget, I mean it, because your average Factor meal is just $12. And if you do want to spend a little bit more money on one of the entrees, the gourmet options, I would not usually recommend microwaved steak, but in this case, I can recommend microwaved steak. So if you'd like to see for yourself why we love Factor, you can head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50LordLodge to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. Again, that is code 50LordLodge at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. And now back to the story about shipping. A cold, barren waste lay before Leif Eriksson and his crew of 35 men. It was around the year 1000 AD, and after sailing several days to the west, they now gazed out upon what they believed to be the last of the strange lands reported by Bjarney Herjulfsson, its scenery dominated by great mountains of ice beyond the rocky plain on which they stood. Herjulfsson had been right to avoid this place, which Eriksson now dubbed Helgeland, and which is now believed to be Baffin Island, on account of its landscape of flat stone. He had gone one step further than his predecessor in landing there, but his conclusion was no different. This was no land worth exploring, and especially not with the knowledge that greater prospects awaited them to the south. So they set sail once again, and not long after came to a more suitable place where broad stretches of white sand gave way to forested flatlands. A creative man, Eriksson called this second landing place Markland, or forest land, understood to be somewhere on the coast of Labrador after the expansive trees which stood before them, and put to sea yet again in search of greener pastures. It was as they came to the third place, where Bjarney had first sighted this new world, that they finally found their journey worthwhile. They had sailed south from Markland for 2 days on a northeasterly wind before finding themselves in an island north of a great landmass, which by all accounts appears to have been Newfoundland. Leif directed the crew to bring them ashore, and quickly they realized that this was very much good land. The grass was laden with sweet dew, and the fair weather beckoned them to explore further. So they boarded their ship and sailed west into what they perceived to be a sound which lay between the island and a cape which jutted out from the land on the north. They soon enough found a place where a river spilled out into the sea, and in typical Viking fashion, they made their way up its course until they came to a lake. Along the way, they found that the fresh water teemed with salmon larger than any they'd ever seen before, and the land was rich with thick grass that would even support cattle herds, something rather impossible, or at least close to it, on the stony shores of Greenland. This, Leif decided, was a good place to make camp and even to stay the winter. They first constructed a large house, after which Leif determined that it would be best to split his men into 2 groups. One would remain at camp to fish and hunt in the waters and forests nearby, while the other he instructed to explore the areas surrounding their camp, though they were to never go beyond a point from which they could return the same evening, nor to separate from one another. So basically, he told them to use the buddy system and not go so far away that you had to spend the night in the wild. Leif himself spent time in both companies, until on one occasion one of their men became separated from the scouting party. He was a German by the name of Tyrker, one of the few non-Greenlanders on their voyage, and more importantly, something of a surrogate father to Leif. Because if you know anything about Eric the Red, there was a reason he was called Eric the Red, and it was not his hair. Anyway, deeply concerned by Tyrker's absence, Leif gathered a dozen of his men and set off in the man's last known direction. And thankfully, it did not take long to find their missing companion, because he was already making his way back by the time anyone realized he was gone, which is something I wish was more frequent in the missing persons cases we cover. Tyrker seemed to be in oddly good spirits, and they soon found out why. He had not gone much farther than any of the rest of them, but in his ever-so-slight bending of the rules, he had uncovered something of great interest: grapevines. Eriksson, as well as the others, were overjoyed by this discovery, because Greenland was a place of snow and stone, and Iceland not altogether much kinder. But this new land not only had forests, fish, and game, but now there was proof that crops could grow there as well. And if they could show proof of their findings, it could be the greatest opportunity for Norse settlement since the invasion of Britain 2 centuries earlier. And as far as they knew, there were no heavily armed Anglo-Saxons to contest them. With that, everything about Eriksson's mission changed. He ordered his men to set about building a second boat to be towed by the first, which would be filled with as many grapes and vines as possible and taken back to Greenland as evidence of their discovery. With the spring thaw, they left their encampment and sailed for Brattahlid, rescuing a capsized ship's crew along the way, and thereby adding to the legend of Leif Eriksson, thenceforth to be known as Leif the Lucky, the first man to step foot in the place he named Vinland, the land of wine. Leif, however, would never return to Vinland. While he was away, a plague had ravaged the settlement in Greenland, and amongst the lives lost there was that of his father, Eric. As the eldest and most renowned in his line, Leif was chosen to lead the Greenlanders as their new chieftain, leaving the task of further exploration of Vinland to his younger brother, Torvald. That is, unless you look to the saga of Eric the Red, in which case it was in fact a foreigner by the name of Thorfinn Karlsefni. And this is where it becomes very difficult to put together a unified narrative regarding what exactly happened with the Norse efforts to colonize Vinland. You see, we have just 2 accounts of these expeditions. One is told in the aforementioned saga of Eric the Red, while the other comes from the saga of the Greenlanders. And while the general story remains the same, a number of details vary drastically from one account to the next. To make matters worse, modern scholars have been unable to determine which of the accounts is the earlier of the 2. Now, the information at this point in the video comes from Greenlanders, and in many ways, that version seems more realistic in its description of events. Eric the Red leaves out Bjarney entirely, but instead has King Olaf Tryggvason send Leif on an otherwise undocumented quest to spread Christianity to Greenland, and it's during that voyage that Leif, not Bjarney, is blown off course and thereby discovers the lands to the west. Another major difference lies with the number of voyages undertaken by the Greenlanders, as well as who led them. In the saga of the Greenlanders, there are 2 separate expeditions right here, one being led by Torvald and the second by Thorfinn. In Eric the Red, on the other hand, there is just one expedition with Thorfinn as the leader, and it is Thorfinn who names the new lands rather than Leif. From there, the narratives diverge even further, only to weave back together in several key places. Furthermore, the Eric the Red narrative is considerably more detailed with regard to Thorfinn's expedition, which is barely a footnote in the other saga. In writing this episode, I came to the conclusion that the best way to explain the story was probably to take a look at those unifying points, and then use that as a framework to explore the differences and what they might tell us about the story of why the Norse, a culture who conquered lands from the wastes of Greenland to the islands of the Mediterranean, failed to gain a foothold in a place they should have flourished. Thorvald Eriksson was struck down on the shores of Vinland, finding his death at the tip of an arrowhead. It happened as he and a crew were exploring the coast, some distance away from their settlement, though precisely how it came to pass differs considerably between the two sources. In Greenlanders, it had been several months since his crew of 30 landed, and as winter thawed into spring, Thorvald ordered a small group of men to take their smaller boat constructed during Leif's voyage for a scouting mission along the coastlines to the west. They found neither dwelling of man nor lair of beast, but in one of the westerly islands, they found a wooden building for the shelter of grain. And as far as they were aware, Leif had built nothing of the sort, and yet there was no trace of any other human construction. Furthermore, Leif's expedition had not traveled so far beyond their landing place, so it seemed unlikely that any of his men could have built this structure either. They couldn't be sure who built it, but it did tell them that they weren't alone, and that was certainly something worth telling Thorvald about. So they turned around and returned to the encampment, though nothing further came of their find. The same would not be true of their missions the following summer. After wintering at Leif's longhouse once again, Thorvald himself led a contingent on an expedition to the east, then around the north of a cape, where the violent winds of the Atlantic blew them ashore somewhere along the eastern coastline of Newfoundland, and damaged their keel badly enough that it required repairs before sailing onward once again. For that reason, Thorvald chose to call this place Keelness, and once their repairs were complete, they made their way eastward once again, and from there into the north of the adjoining firth, though it's admittedly very difficult to map this route given how much it simply doesn't match the geography of Newfoundland. But we'll get to that later. In any case, when they arrived there, Thorvald noted that there were plenty of trees and good land for building, and opted to establish a more permanent settlement there. Before he had any opportunity to do so, however, they came upon yet another indication that they were not alone in this place. Just beyond the headland where they landed, they spotted 3 strange mounds on the sand. Thorvald and his men approached to investigate, and as they moved in closer, they understood what it was they were looking at. The mounds were canoes, and beneath each one were 3 men. Upon seeing them, Thorvald ordered the men seized, only for one to escape with his canoe and row off into the firth. And in what would seem to have just been an act of senseless brutality, Thorvald then ordered all 8 of the remaining men killed, though this would prove to be a fatal mistake. As they returned to the headland and their ship, Thorvald's men spotted several mounds along the shores of the firth, which they presumed to be the dwellings of the men they had just slain. Before they could do anything with that information, however, it said that the party suddenly became very tired, and they quickly fell into a deep slumber. That would have been the end of them, if not for an ethereal voice which called out to them, saying,
"Awake, Thorvald, thou art on thy company, if thou wilt save thy life, and board thy ship with all thy men, and sail with all speed for the land."
All at once the company awoke, at which point they saw the danger before them. Down in the firth were countless canoes laden with armed men, and they were headed towards the Norsemen. With great haste, Thorvald's men ran back to the ship, where they placed their shields upon the gunwales in an attempt to provide cover from the hail of missiles they expected were very soon to arrive. Centuries of warfare had taught the Norsemen well, and they knew their best option was likely to remain within their makeshift fort until their enemies ran out of ammunition. This proved the correct course of action, as one by one the attackers began to draw back towards their village until the longship stood alone by the shoreline. The danger having passed, Thorvald asked his men if everyone was okay, and was grateful to find that no injuries had been sustained during the barrage. At least, no injuries to anyone else. Thorvald, however, had taken an arrow to the chest. It had slipped between shield and ship, and found its way under his armpit. The captain knew that he was not likely to survive, and with what energy remained, he instructed his crew that they should return at once to the longhouse built by his brother, and from there return to Greenland with news of his death. And as his last request, he He asked to be buried there on the headland and a cross planted at his gravesite. But before they returned to Greenland, the story tells us that they took their departure and rejoined their companions, and they told each other of the experiences which had befallen them. And this is interesting because it ties in with the account in the saga of Eric the Red. And in that version, Torvald was not the commander of this expedition. As was previously mentioned, where the saga of the Greenlanders suggests two separate yet closely timed voyages by Torvald and Thorfinn, the other source argues that these were one great combined effort. And the intriguing part is that Torvald's little side quest is present in both, but under significantly different circumstances. According to the saga of Eric the Red, Torvald still arrived in Vinland with 30 men, but as part of the much larger force of 160 men, commanded by Karlsefni. Early on, there are several slight changes, such as the reason for the naming of Keelness, that being for a keel that they simply found washed ashore there, the lack of any mention of the longhouse said to have been built by Leif, and of course Thorfinn's naming of the new lands. In fact, it appears that Thorfinn is credited with most of the things for which Greenlanders assigns credit to Leif, as even the landing place he chooses is described in much the same way in both sources, though instead of being called Leif's Booths, it's referred to as Hulp. One of the most major changes, however, is with regard to their first contact with the native peoples, which in the Eric the Red narrative is far more friendly. In that version, shortly after Thorfinn Karlsefni and his men landed, about 2 weeks according to the saga, the Norsemen spotted 9 canoes out in the waters of the lagoon, another small difference as the other source mentions a lake. The men within carried staves which made a noise like flails as their bearers swung them around counterclockwise. Karlsefni and his men were unsure of what this meant, but opted to present a white shield in an attempt to show that they meant no harm to their visitors. It must have been perceived as intended because the canoes turned and began rowing towards the shore. And as they approached, the Norse were able to get a better look at these strange folk. Darker in skin tone, with large eyes and broad cheekbones, and of smaller stature than the explorers they came to greet. They stopped just before the shoreline, where they waited for a time as each side observed the other, and then, without a word, they rowed out around the cape to the south until they passed out of view. Now, they would not see these new folk again until the next year, but when they did return, they came seeking trade. One morning early in the spring, the Norse awoke to find that the waters around their fledgling settlement were filled with countless canoes. Once again, they waved their staves, and Karlsefni's men raised their shields in reply, signaling that they were welcome to approach. Despite an inability to communicate verbally, or perhaps due to an unmentioned familiarity with their language, they managed to set up a small market to trade with one another. The people of the canoes were very interested in the woven fabrics of the Norsemen, in particular red cloths, and in exchange they traded pelts and skins to the newcomers. But when they showed interest in the steel weapons of the Greenlanders, Karlsefni refused to barter them away, whether it was for fear of being used against them or due to their value outweighing anything the natives could offer is unclear, but it wasn't up for discussion either way. Now, the trouble with this meeting came when one of the bulls brought to Vinland by the Norse emerged from the woods, apparently angered by something and bellowing so loudly that the tribesmen panicked and bolted for their canoes. In the blink of an eye, they were gone, rounding the bend and turning around southward as they had done the year prior. This time, only 3 weeks passed before they were seen again, and as with their 2 prior appearances, they came waving their staves, but this time something was different. They appeared agitated, and their staves were flailing in the opposite direction as before. Karlsefni and his men quickly realized that something must be wrong, and in response raised red shields to show that they were prepared to defend themselves. But the warning went unheeded, and the people who would henceforth be known to the Norse as Skraelings leapt from their boats to engage the sea wolf shield wall. The skirmish began with a hail of slingshot sent towards the Greenlanders, which was followed by the appearance of a rather odd kind of weapon. It was a large ball mounted atop a tall pole, which they flung towards the rear of the Norse lines. Whatever it was, it made a loud, frightening noise which completely demoralized the already overwhelmed defenders. They broke ranks and fled up the riverbanks behind them, Skraelings appearing from seemingly every angle, until at last they came to a place where they could mount a proper defense. It is then said in the Eric the Red account that a daughter of Eric named Freydis took up the sword of one of the fallen Norsemen, tore the front of her dress open, and beat the weapon against her bare breast as she screamed in the faces of her attackers. The Skraelings apparently did not appreciate this, and ran in terror back to their canoes, fleeing by sea once more as the Norse cheered after them. But the joy at their victory was short-lived, and upon their return to the Longhouse, they took stock of the situation. The battle had been a tactical victory, with the heavily armed Greenlanders losing only 2 men and killing many more of their attackers. But the broader circumstances of their expedition had clearly changed. Furthermore, the fallen man whom Freydis took the sword from was Thorbrand, son of Snorri, who was Karlsefni's second in command. It now seemed clear to Karlsefni and his people, reads the saga, that although the country thereabouts was attractive, their life would be one of constant dread and turmoil by reason of the hostility of the inhabitants of the country, so they forthwith prepared to leave, and determined to return to their own country. And it is here that we rejoin the narrative of the saga of the Greenlanders, at least for a moment. As Karlsefni's men sailed northward off the coast from their settlement at Hop, they found 5 Skraelings clad in skin doublets lying asleep near the sea. Thinking them outlaws even of their own people, Karlsefni's men killed all of them and then returned to their ships. It's probably worth pointing out that in this version, what had appeared to be a senseless massacre in the other saga becomes a much more understandable one in light of the existing hostilities and the Norse legal system regarding outlaws. And to quickly explain that, what it meant to be an outlaw in ancient Norway, Iceland, Greenland, was that you were literally outside of the law. It was a sentence that could last anywhere from a few months to your entire life, and during the time you were an outlaw, that meant that you could be killed, you could be robbed, people could do basically anything they wanted to you, and there would be no punishment to them. This was typically a sentence reserved for the worst kinds of crimes, like murder and assault of a certain kind. So it wasn't like if you just stole something, you were going to become an outlaw. But in Eric the Red's case, for example, he killed a bunch of people, and so he was outlawed and went to Greenland. For some reason in this case, Karlsefni made the assumption that, oh, these must be outlaws, therefore let's just kill them and do everyone a favor. In any case, shortly after this, the narrative brings Torvald back into the story for the first time since he was mentioned at the beginning. It happened one morning, the saga reads, that Karlsefni and his companions discovered in an open space in the woods above them a speck, which seemed to shine toward them. They appear to have been resting on a riverbank, some of them still in the boat, and some members of the party decided it would be best to shout at this speck. As soon as they did so, however, the speck moved, and revealed itself to be what the Arthur Middleton Reeves translation refers to as a uniped, a one-footed man, apparently of a race familiar to the authors of the saga. Before anyone could react, this strange one-footed man loosed an arrow at them, which found its way into Torvald's abdomen and mortally wounded him. As with the Greenlanders' account, Torvald commented on the quality of the land, and then passed away on the spot, at which point their attacker retreated to the north and up a small creek. There's clearly a lot to unpack there, but that's not even the half of it. You see, in the Greenlanders' version of the story, the conflict between Karlsefni's people and the Skraelings kicks off for largely the same reason, though with a few minor variations, and one major one. From the moment Karlsefni's settlers met the Skraelings, it would seem there was a significant amount of tension, whether due to a lack of ability to communicate, or possibly because of the fact that Torvald's death occurred before Karlsefni's expedition ever left Greenland, at least in the saga of the Greenlanders account. The really interesting part, however, is how the conflict develops. As with Eric the Red, there are multiple encounters between the Norse and the Skraelings, but they occur under significantly more stressful circumstances. When they first meet, the natives do not come in canoes, but they rather just kind of emerge from the forests outside of the settlement. In doing so, they startle one of the bulls, and end up being frightened themselves, which results in them running toward Karlsefni's longhouse. Understandably, he orders his men to defend the dwelling, and after a bit of mutually unintelligible shouting, they all calm down and begin to trade. The Norse take pelts, which the natives happily trade for dairy products, and that episode ends amicably enough. But the discovery of other people so close to their homes leads Karlsefni to order his men to build a palisade around the settlements, which proves to have been a good plan when a much larger group of Skraelings returns sometime later with interest in another Norse product, steel weapons. As with the other saga, Karlsefni declines to sell them any of the precious axes, but this time the Skraelings do not take no for an answer. Instead, they try to take them by force, and with disastrous consequences. The Greenlanders kill at least one of them, and the rest drop what they're carrying and run off into the forests. Karlsefni then quickly organizes a council in preparation for what he believes will be an imminent attack, which is a major departure from the Eric the Red narrative. Rather than being caught off guard and forced into a defensive retreat, Karlsefni divides his forces and even orders his men to use one of the bulls as a psychological weapon. They crush the Skraeling war party, killing many of them with no mention of Norse casualties whatsoever. Finally, apparently once the fighting had concluded, a particularly large member of the native war party, believed to be their chief, picked up one of the Greenlanders' axes, killed one of his own men with it, and then threw it off into the sea. And no explanation of this action is given, though for the obvious reason that nobody spoke Skraeling. But if I were to wager a guess, I'd say the slain man was probably responsible for the decision to attack the Norse in the first place. Now, interestingly, Freydis is left out of the battle narrative entirely, though she's not left out of the story. Instead, after Karlsefni's men return to Greenland, she goes off on another expedition with the Norwegian brothers Helgi and Finnbogi. Immediately upon their arrival, she begins antagonizing the brothers, first denying them access to Leif's settlement. Then, after the first winter in Vinland, she goes to Finnbogi in the middle of the night with an offer to buy his ship, under the auspices that she plans to return to Greenland as soon as possible. She wants his ship because it's bigger and can carry more cargo. Finnbogi actually agrees to this, but despite that, Freydis then deceives her own husband by telling him that the brothers not only declined her offer, but then that they also beat her for even daring to ask. Because of this insult, he takes an armed group of men to the brothers' settlement, where they slaughter every last man, but refuse to do the same to the women and children. Freydis, however, is not satisfied, and after demanding an axe from one of the men, she ensures that they're all dead. Not just the men, but the women, and the children too. Once again, this is a major departure from the account in the saga of Eric the Red, wherein Freydis Eriksdottir has an entirely separate fate, and one which paints her in a much kinder, even heroic light. But in order to explain that, we need to back up for a moment. You see, for the sake of storytelling, I deliberately left out what happened between the decision to leave Vinland and the death of Torvald, as well as a little bit of what happened before and after these events, at least as it pertains to the Eric the Red account. As that story goes, before Karlsefni and his men got to the place where they would eventually build their colony, they made several stops not mentioned in the account of Leif Eriksson's voyage from the other saga, one of which was in a place they called Streamfjordur, or Straumfjordur. I'm trying. This location was marked by an island at the entrance to a firth, somewhere that should be to the north of the settlement at Leif's Booths and or Hop. So why is that important? It's because of what happens after Karlsefni and his men depart from Vinland. Following their battle against the Skraelings and the massacre of the 5 outlaws on the beach, they left their settlement and returned to their winter camp at Straumfjordur. Before heading back to Greenland, however, Karlsefni reportedly made 2 voyages from this location. First, he and a small contingent of 40 men returned to their settlement at Hop, where they stayed for 2 months before going back to Straumsfjordur. The second voyage took them north around Kilness, and then west along a coast covered in forested wilderness, which they kept to their port side. At some point they turned inland and made portage on a river which flowed from east to west, and it was along that river that Torvald met his fate. But before Torvald's untimely deaths on the banks of some unknown river, Karlsefni's expedition may have in fact split in 2. According to the saga of Eric the Red, Freydis, who is not a murderer, is said to have made the decision to remain at this, I'm going to call it Streamfirth. I'm going to use the English translation from now on. She makes the decision to stay at Streamfirth prior to Karlsefni's second voyage. And apparently, approximately 100 other members of the group opted to stay there with her. Interestingly enough, the saga of Eric the Red actually says some people say this happened, but it doesn't go so far as to say this is what happened. In any case, Karlsefni would spend one last winter there after the death of Torvald, but the majority of the remaining settlers reportedly did not return to Greenland with him, which, if this saga is to be believed, means that Freydis formed a second settlement somewhere in either Newfoundland or Labrador. On the other hand, Greenlanders has her telling her own people that they are to take the true story of what happened to their graves, and that everyone back in Greenland is to be told that Helgi and Finnbogi and the rest of their people decided to remain in Vinland. And that suggests something very interesting about the origin of these 2 stories. Of course, they are at their core the same story. They share numerous characters, locations, and conflicts. It's true that in this version, the leader of the expedition was Karlsefni and not Torvald, and that the death of Torvald came at the hands of a single ambusher rather than a flotilla of enemies. But at the same time, we see the bit about a number of Skraelings being slaughtered on a beach before Torvald is killed by an arrow. In addition, the description of Leif's boots in Greenlanders matches very well with the description of Hulp in Eric the Red, but we also see that one story suggests one settlement, while the other clearly describes at least two. These aspects, among other things, might lead us to believe that these are simply two variants of the same story, with the differences being purely the result of two different independent accounts being passed down through the centuries. But that may actually not be the case. The thing is, no matter how hard you try to weave these two narratives together into a coherent story, the contradictions are ultimately irreconcilable. On the face of it, the more detailed saga of Eric the Red feels more coherent, but that may actually indicate that it's the less accurate of the two, and there are a number of reasons to think that it is not only younger than the saga of the Greenlanders, but a deliberate revision. I'm going to get into that in more detail in the next episode, but to give you a quick summary version, there's two main things here. First of all, Saga of the Greenlanders is a story about Leif Eriksson and his family, or more realistically, Eric the Red and his family. It's the kind of story that you would expect to be told in Greenland by the Greenlanders. In addition, it really doesn't pull punches. It describes Norsemen in a way that a lot of sources would describe Norsemen. The saga of Eric the Red, on the other hand, doesn't focus so much on the Eriksson family. Instead, it tells the story of a number of Norsemen. And that's the kind of thing that would be more popular in an Icelandic audience. Now, both of these sagas, in their oldest extant format, do come from Iceland. And it's generally understood that the Greenlanders account probably originated as oral tradition, perhaps supported by journals and logbooks. Whereas the Eric the Red edition, we don't know as much. It feels a lot more structured in the way that something that originated as a written text might. That's not to say that it didn't in some way originate as an oral tradition, but the point here is that it's more structured, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. This is the part where I'm riffing. I didn't write any of this down. But then another indicator about the Eric the Red narrative is that it is more heavily Christian. It talks about Christianity a lot. It talks negatively about paganism, whereas in the other one, religion's not really a topic. Leif Eriksson and many of his sailors probably would have been Christians at this point, but that's not the focus of the narrative that spends the most time looking at him. Most of Leif's presence in the saga of Eric the Red is him as a Christianizer, him as a man sent to convert the Greenlanders. And this comes into play when you look at the behavior of the Greenlanders in the saga of Eric the Red, as opposed to the saga of the Greenlanders. Because in Greenlanders, Torvald just kills a bunch of people for no reason. Freydis does a very deceitful thing and ends up killing half a colony, including women and children. But in Eric the Red, if this is the later text, and I believe that it is, and I went and checked with one of my professors from college, who's one of the foremost Viking scholars in the world, and he also agreed with me on this, at least it being the older part. But if you look at it, Eric the Red might even restructure the story and change the order of things so that the actions of the Norsemen are legitimate, so that they make sense in a Christian context. If you're attacked first, it's okay to commit violence in retaliation. In the Greenlanders account, there's really no cause for the violence on the side of the Greenlanders. And then, of course, there's also some other aspects, other places that are mentioned that say maybe this one story came later. Maybe there were more expeditions, and that they all kind of got rolled into one. You know, it may seem that these details are unimportant to the overall question of what happened to the Vinland colony, but the truth is that they may be crucial to understanding the issue of why the Norse really left North America. Because if we're being realistic here, these are people who fought 200 years of wars, and at the time of this story were actively still fighting those wars against the Anglo-Saxons, people who had steel armor, steel weapons, stratified society, large armies. This is the 11th century. It's only going to be another 60-some years until William the Conqueror arrives on the shores of England. Harald Hardrada, one of the most famous Viking warriors to ever live, may not have even been born yet. Depending on exactly when we date this journey, a guy named Ethelred the Unready might be in charge of England. Which, what a way to go down in history, being known as the Unready. My point is that there's something that doesn't make sense about the narrative here. It feels like something is missing, and I want to go deeper into what that is. But in order to do that, we need to first establish where and what Vinland actually was, and whether or not Lanzo Meadows was ever a part of the sagas at all. Because if that little settlement isn't Leif's booths, we have a whole bunch of other questions. But all of that is going to have to wait until the second half of this episode, which you will be getting just a week from today, unless you're watching this like 3 months from now, in which case they're both up and it's linked in the description, so just go watch it. Now, I am curious, and I understand this is probably going to be a little lopsided, because if you're still here, you definitely liked that we covered Vikings, and if you aren't still here, then maybe you didn't. But if you're somebody who's been watching our channel for a while, let us know. Is this kind of the kind of thing you guys want to see? Is this fun for you to go on these little journeys through unsolved, mysterious periods of history? And if so, tell us some other ones you'd like us to look at. Currently, I have a lot of questions about the Anasazi and also the Nazca lines. And as it pertains to this story, I'd love to hear your opinions, because honestly, I was so very confused trying to figure out where any of these people went. One of the parts of the saga says that they sailed into a river on the east coast of Canada that flows from east to west. What? Pretty much every river I could find on the east coast of Canada flowed from west to east. At least specifically if we're talking about Labrador, which is where it looks like that river was. Anyway, if you like what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, please hit the like button, hit the notification bell. YouTube won't actually tell you when a video goes up, but it does tell them you're interested. If you'd like to support us directly, the best way you can do that is by going over to Patreon and becoming a member there. You can also become a member here on YouTube for the same prices, just $1 a month. But Patreon comes with cooler stuff, at least at the higher tiers. Once you get like $5 a month and above, you get things like posters and mugs. If you'd like to support us in a different way, perhaps consuming our essence, you can do that by going to tableauroastingco.com and purchasing our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk. And if you would like to wear our skin, you can go to bunkerbranding.com and order Lore Lodge merch there. The best way to get updates about what we're doing, when new stuff is coming out, things like that, is through our Discord, which is linked in the description. And you can also catch Thornbury, my producer over here. He's wonderful. He's off in the corner, though. Don't bother him. You can catch us live Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless it's not, and we'll tell you if it's not. And if you're just looking for more Lodge, you've got 2 channels, The Weird Bible and also History Unhinged. Both of those are collaborative projects, the former with Wendigoon, the latter with Stakuyi, History of Everything, and they're great. Also, in response to your feedback, I'm trying to tighten up this segment, so yeah, with all that said, I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.